Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special election preview where we're looking ahead to Japan's 2025 election, just sort of having a deep dive into what's at stake, the issues that are involved, what's happened running up to the election, and what some possible outcomes could be, and just having a general look through. Now, when is the election? It's happening 20th of July 2025. That's now been confirmed, the exact date. And already there's been a little bit of consternation at the date because that happens to fall during a 3-day weekend in Japan. And so there's been some concerns about what that impact that could have on the result, on turnout. There's always these sort of things that go into consideration around elections, like, oh, what if there's bad weather? What if it rains? What could the time of year have to do with the turnout? And so I suppose the fear is that it's possibly bad for people who are sort of going on holiday or going to see relatives during the long weekend, people who have plans. But, I mean, obviously this could be said to affect all parties broadly across the Japanese spectrum. My gut instinct is it isn't necessarily that good for the LDP, because you'd think people who want the status quo, i.e. the LDP, the minority government, and they've had some problems, also the LDP, since the last election, they're probably not the most high motivation voters, whereas you think very high motivation voters, people who want change, might be more inclined to go out. But it just depends how these things shake out. I think it will affect everyone a small amount to a different extent. Now, what's happened in the run-up to this election that could possibly affect the outcome, what people are thinking? Well, one big thing is that Trump has said some fairly negative things in terms of a possible trade deal, which LDP certainly won't want. Ishiba has been working very hard for this. He's been having talks ongoing with Trump, and he must have been really hoping that he could have locked this down before the election to have a nice positive news story, cut off the economic uncertainty that's going on about a possible tariffs hitting Japan even more than they currently are. And it would have been a really nice positive story for him to take into the election if he'd managed to get this done. But Trump appears to effectively be ruling out any trade deal happening at the moment. He's also made some fairly negative comments where he said that Japan is effectively selfish. And I believe he threatened tariffs originally of 30 to 35%, something like that. Now what he's looking at is, I believe, a bit lower than that. It's something like 20 to 25 he's looking at imposing on Japan, as well as other countries in Asia. And so that's really disappointing from Ishiba's point of view. He really would have wanted to have a bit more positive result than that. Really doesn't bode well for him. I suppose it's interesting to think, because Trump originally, there was some murmurings that maybe Trump didn't like Ishiba that much. So it's wondering sort of, obviously I can't really get into Trump's head and know what he's thinking with this. You could speculate that maybe there's an element of him wanting to cause difficulty for Ishiba, because if he has a bad result in this election, and he's already had struggles with the gift scandal, etc., minority government, a tough first period in office, a bad result here could be enough to see him away. I think that's relatively unlikely, at least as the sole motivation is what Trump's doing. I mean, for one thing, he's targeting these tariffs on other countries. And I also sort of suspect that this really isn't his final position, but I'm not basing that on anything, just pure gut instinct, that I think he's angling for something and he's putting pressure on countries and he's wanting some sort of concession back. And that I suspect these 20-25% tariffs he's talking about won't be here, at least in the long term, these higher tariffs. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. But it's given, I believe, the deadline he's talking about for these new tariffs to come in is 1st of August. So he's sort of putting it off a little bit. And given the elections on 20th of July, maybe something can be worked out beforehand, but it's getting increasingly hard to see that. And it's really looking like Ishiba's positive result he would have wanted to get out of Trump, and through these talks is not likely to happen. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens in the long run with that. But yeah, that's a disappointing thing that Ishiba can't go into the elections campaigning on that and saying he's got a trade deal done with Trump and he's seen off this uncertainty. And I think really the outcome of this, I think, is that Ishiba really needs to be leaning over Koizumi, who's the new farming minister, who's in put in charge of this rice crisis, and he needs to be really putting the pressure on and saying, you need to make the rice flow. The rice needs to start flowing even more than you have done. You need to speed up the release of the reserves. You need to potentially even look at bringing in more imports, which would have previously been unthinkable, and is part of what Trump has called Japan out for doing, for saying they're they're selfish for not importing more American rice, and it's not a reciprocal trade deal, a trade arrangement they have currently. He sort of called them out on that. I think given that the Trump trade deal is now off the cards, I think the government really needs some sort of positive story to go into the 20th of July. And if a trade deal's out, he really needs to aim to get positive movement, if not to completely solve the rice crisis, so he can have something to point into as a positive achievement for the government going into the elections. So he really needs to look at that and really put pressure on Koizumi to get things going before the 20th of July, in my opinion. Obviously, Koizumi's been fairly active, and he's making a lot of moves, and he said a lot of things about the rice crisis, and he's got some rice released into the system already. But they really need to have a good result on that, I think, going into the elections, so they have something positive to talk about, in my opinion. Another interesting thing that's happened in the lead up to the election is the DPFP leader. Now, I've talked about Tamaki, the leader of the DPFP, before. He had a very good result in the previous election. His party, they grew their vote share quite well, and so they would have been hoping to have made some moves in the interim, to have a positive message, and to go into this election and get a good result in the 2025 election as well. Now, Tamaki had to step down temporarily because of a personal crisis, a marital affair, an extramarital affair, I should say, and he's now come back, and he's unfortunately landed himself and put his foot in it a bit with some statements he's made, and very unfortunate timing heading just into the election. There was a lot of speculation about how well the DPFP might do in this election, and there was also speculation that if they did well, and if the LDP didn't do so well, perhaps Tamaki could even be a potential coalition partner and the next Prime Minister of Japan even. I mean, there was a lot of buzz going around that. But I think he's really diminished those hopes on both fronts with these recent statements. So essentially, he was giving an interview and speaking in English, and the topic, I believe, came up of DPFP and women voters, and why aren't they doing quite as well with women voters as they are with men? And he said words roughly to the effect of why he wasn't doing so well with women. Our policy is good, not only for men, but also women. I think it's very difficult to understand for them. And the implication taken away from that, from critics of that statement, is that women aren't capable of understanding, or they're just not capable of understanding it, which is a bit insulting. So, yeah, I mean, if you were going to be charitable about this, you could think maybe he's not speaking in his first language. Maybe he meant something along the lines of, we have policies that we think are good for women, but they're just not getting through. They haven't been circulated well enough. We haven't seen the effect from them yet. But to say women aren't understanding them as if they're the ones at fault, or they're incapable somehow of understanding the DPFP's policies, is very, very poor wording, even if it's not in your first language. So to say that at all is really putting your foot in it, is going to obviously invite criticism, and that seems to have put a bit of a negative press spin on the DPFP heading into this election, and really curbed the momentum that was being spoken about with them ahead of a very good 2024 election. And so we'll have to see how they do in the election, but I think that has maybe dulled their promise in this election, and has given a bit of a welcome reprieve for the LDP, and given possibly opportunity to other parties as well by saying that. Another thing that's worth thinking about is what are individual parties looking at? What are some interesting targets? And I've sort of just picked out two highlights, really, that I think are worth looking at, that I think are particularly interesting. Obviously, each party will have their own targets, but LDP, the current minority government of Japan, and it's worth saying this is the upper house election, so this is not going to affect who the government in the primary house is, the lower house of Japan, which is the primary body for legislation going through. The upper house is sort of more like the House of Lords in the UK, a second body, but still influential, and it still is a very clear bellwether for what the public are thinking. And really, you'd want, as a government, if you're going to be effective, a working majority in both houses. And obviously, the LDP only have a minority government in the lower house. They'd really like to hold on to a working majority where they can get legislation through in the upper house as well. So to think about what the targets will be for each individual parties, an interesting one is the LDP. Now, they currently have 113 seats in the upper house in Japan. That's out of a total of 248. And if you roll in Komeito in there, that gives them 140. So that's a fairly healthy working majority out of 248. They also, of that 113 seats, they have 75 not for election. So 75 seats that are safe this election, this term, that won't be at threat. And interestingly, Ishiba has set an initial target for the LDP going into this election of 50 seats, which is enough for him to keep his majority. And this itself has drawn concern and criticism from his own party, I believe, with some sort of saying this isn't a very ambitious target. It's quite a low target. Obviously, there's lots of reasons for Ishiba to do this. It's a fairly conservative bet to say 50 rather than 60 seats, for example, which is maybe what some in the LDP would want for them to be going after. That means even if they don't do as well as he's probably hoping, at least he can keep his majority and he can say, well, I can claim a victory. We're going through a difficult term. We're facing problems, but I've kept the government's majority, which shows I am an effective leader and I haven't lost the LDP, their working majority. So, you should probably stick with me because I've enabled us to continue in government. And he can at least claim victory from that fairly low bar. Now, obviously, he's going to want more than that, ideally. If they get, say, 60 seats, that'll be a much more positive sign of the value of continuity and keeping on with Ishiba. If it goes below 50 and they lose their majority, I think, just my personal speculation, given that there's been problems already in Ishiba's reign, I think really that could be it. If they lose their majority, I think that will be a very bad sign for the government, and I think the LDP, there will be a lot of murmuring and pressure then and talk about a possible need for him to step down or even initiate a leadership challenge. Don't know anything about LDP insider politics. That's just my speculation as to what I think would happen if he was to lose his working majority in the upper house and to fall short of his target of around 50 seats. I think a very interesting scenario would be if he was to fall somewhere within 50 to 60 range in the election, which would mean that Ishiba could technically claim he'd done what he wanted, which was to keep his majority. He'd met his target, but there'd be a number of LDP insiders, people within his party who'd wanted a more pushy target of 60, who'd not seen him meet that and who would be disappointed in the result. And so then that would be a very tense situation where Ishiba's claiming victory. He wants to carry on. He can point to the fact that he's met the minimum he wanted to meet, but there'd be a number of people within the LDP who are not happy but cannot necessarily say it's a complete disaster. That creates a very tense situation. And obviously there's not a clear successor, as I've discussed before, to Ishiba within the LDP. So that creates difficulties. And one possibility, as I mentioned, was to a coalition with another party like, say, Tamaki. But given he's now himself diminished, that would have helped bridge this gap in the upper house as well to draw on any potential DPFP seats in the upper house. But that's now been removed as an option. So it creates even more difficulties for the LDP to think, what do we do if there's a number of people unhappy, it's in that 50 to 60 seat range. It's entirely possible that that'll be enough for Ishiba to claim victory and just carry on, even though there'll be some grumbling. But there will be an element within his party that'll be unhappy with that, and it'll be interesting to see just how tense it is, how unhappy they are, and how much they're willing to push it in that 50 to 60 scenario. It might be they bide their time and wait for something else to happen if that's the only negative thing that happens around this time. But it'll be interesting, as I say, just how tense things are if that's the result. Another target I thought was quite interesting is that Sanseito, which is a fairly new party, it's a sort of a right-wing populist party within Japan. They're aiming for 6 seats, which sounds not the highest to aim for 6. It seems like a fairly low number. But bear in mind, A, they're a fairly new party, and B, I believe they have a fairly low number of seats. I think they've only got 2 in the upper house. I think that's, in my opinion, quite punchy to aim to go up to 6. And I think, given how things are looking for them, it could possibly even be higher than that. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how well Sanseito do on that target and if they surpass it and just how well they do. Following this difficulty with the DPFP, Sanseito have been looking quite good in some recent polls, and there's been talk of, is there a rise of a new right wing in Japan? Are these right-wing populist parties surging? Which leads for a pushing off interesting conversation point of, is the right wing sort of this new renewed right wing rising in Japan? there's the Sanseito party, obviously, we talked about just then. They're surging really in the polls and doing quite well in a number of opinion polls I've seen. They might not be doing so well in terms of winning seats on a district-to-district level, but given some seats will be taken proportionally from the total votes across the vote across Japan, they might do better in the proportional vote and pick up some seats that way. They might also do well in some regional seats, so that'll be interesting to see if they pick up regional votes as well. There's also a general theme of, I'd say, right-wing conversation points, anti-immigration talk, generally being a theme for this election, which has fed into this sort of question if there's along with the polls, if there's a sort of a renewed rising in this sort of populist right-wing within Japan, and whether these new right-wing populist parties are going to make gains, if they're going to threaten the LDP, and what's that's going to do for the electoral spectrum as well. And you can see this from Sanseito. They've said some fairly populist things. Sanseito, generally, their voter profile skews a bit younger, and they sort of came out of COVID. And, for example, the Sanseito leader, I believe in a speech, said that gender equality, in quote, is a mistake. And they've also, a big achievement they've done recently is overtaking the DPFP, who I say have had this recent foot in the mouth moment of criticising women, of saying that him being quoted speaking English, of saying we're not winning votes in women effectively because they're not understanding our policies, which has gone down fairly poorly. They've fallen behind Sanseito in the polls, which is a big achievement for Sanseito to do that. And it's interesting that Sanseito can say things like gender equality was a mistake. I suppose because they feed into this sort of populist space, they've got more freedom to say things like that, whereas the DPFP say something that's seen as being a bit negative about women, but that very much hurts their electoral prospects, whereas Sanseito seem to be doing absolutely fine in the polls after saying that, which you think might hurt them with some women, depending on your opinion on that. So that's interesting as well. There's also the Conservative Party of Japan, which profiles a bit older in terms of their vote. That's a bit more of very broadly speaking, a sort of a middle-aged in terms of their support, and skews a bit older than Sanseito, but it's also a right-wing populist party. They've also had some anti-immigration rhetoric going into this campaign as well, and they've also got, which will be interesting to see, they've got a bit of a regional hold in Nagoya, and they won a mayoral election there recently as well. So it will be interesting to see how they do broadly across the country, and also if they make possibly regional gains in Nagoya. I don't know how many, if any, seats in that region or the neighbouring regions are up for grabs in the Upper House Council, but that'll be interesting to look at. Another element of this sort of interesting element of this sort of populist parties running in this Upper House election, because Takashi Tachibana, who's associated with the NHK party, he's the leader of that, although there's been some disputes about who's leading the anti-NHK party, I believe, in the past. But he's back running in this election as well. It's interesting he's back in Hyogo province because he previously ran effectively as technically an opposing candidate against Governor Saito, but he actually sort of ran interference for him, and he was effectively campaigning for him, even though he was on the ballot as a separate candidate. And he was successful in getting him re-elected in Hyogo, and it's interesting he's now running in Hyogo Prefecture in the House of Councillors. So it'll be interesting to see how he does, having him return to the political scene. But he's come out and made some comments which I don't think I can quite repeat, but raising concerns generally about foreigners in Japan. So he's drawn a lot of news attention for his remarks as well in a stump speech recently. So it'll be interesting to see how he does. And I mentioned a moment ago the Conservative Party of Japan. Naoki Hayakusa has also made a stump speech where he's made some sort of generally anti-immigration remarks. I even read, I've even seen one or two articles speculating that it may have been hate speech as well, what he said. So again, I won't repeat it here, but there's a sort of a general trend of these populist parties getting a lot of press attention in this election, and coming out with some fairly populist sort of anti-immigration rhetoric. And so it'll be interesting to see generally how they do in the election as well, and to see what effect this has on sort of the long-term future of Japanese politics. Because effectively these parties are flanking LDP on the right, and Ishiba has to really hold together a coalition of maybe the elements within the LDP who are a little bit more reformist, a bit less right-wing, and he lost some, I believe, members sort of more associated with the Abe faction, who'd be sort of more in Seinai Takeichi's camp in the 2024 election. So he sort of has to hold that election together, but he's now being flanked on his right by these new populist parties. So if the end result is that Ishiba stays in government, he manages to hold on to his majority, but these new populist parties do quite well. That then puts a lot of pressure on him to maybe move a bit further to his right flank to sort of cut off that threat and to stop losing more support to them in future and in the next election. And that would really hamper conversations of things like, for example, allowing surname choice or dual surnames for married couples. These traditionalist parties are broadly quite against that, I think. Generally, they're against the move away from tradition of allowing married couples to choose their surnames as opposed to just adopting the shared surname, which is the status quo. So things like cooperation with other parties to get surname reform through Japan's parliament and would likely really be much more difficult if these right-wing parties were seen as maybe a long-term threat to the LDP. And you can imagine any number of other issues, for example, immigration laws, things of that nature. Any other possible moves in Japan would be sort of made through a different sphere if the LDP has to be more fearful of a threat from their right flank, really. And another thing to think about is if the LDP do quite badly and that this means that Ishiba goes out after this election, well, then Seinai Takeichi, who previously was a bit diminished because of, as I say, the Abe faction made some losses. She made a run and was initially the front runner to become the prime minister and leader of the LDP, but ultimately lost out to Ishiba. She appeared a bit diminished after those two moments in recent history. And there was also noise about possibly Koizumi, if he does well in this position of trying to solve the rice crisis, he could be looking very favourable as a future leader. But if the election ends with Ishiba going and the real threat of a emerging right wing there being seen as harmful for the LDP's future, then you have to think Seinai could very possibly be in pole position to say, well, I'm a much more naturally conservative, more traditionalist candidate who could see off a threat from these parties potentially. And I believe she's taken positions like not wanting reform on surnames and things like that. So it really would strengthen her hand if these parties were to do well and then Ishiba were to go as a potential candidate. So it's another interesting prospect to think about, whether or not the LDP do well and maintain their majority. If these new right-wing parties have a good election, it changes sort of the calculus of where the LDP might go in future and what might happen in terms of legislation throughout the rest of the parliament. If they're seen as more of a threat, now that especially the DPFP, as I mentioned, is a little bit diminished in the polls as well and have had this recent controversy, they were seen as a rising party, as sort of a populist threat, but it might be that the attention will be drawn, as I say, to the right in future if they have a good election. So that's very interesting for the prospect of Japanese politics, and whether this potential muted rise of a new right wing in Japan turns out to be real. We'll just have to wait and see. And also to touch very briefly on a few other interesting points about this election. Another thing is I've had a very quick look at some of the pledges. And this isn't exhaustive. I haven't looked at every party, but I've just picked out a few interesting ones to give sort of a sense of what different parties have on offer. Now, the LDP, I've mentioned, they don't want to make so much a consumption tax cut because I think they fear that the cost of that would be far greater, and it's harder once you've given a tax cut to take it away again. But what they're offering instead is sort of this cash giveaway I've talked about, where they'll give cash to every citizen to sort of fight the cost of living difficulties and sort of generally aid every citizen by giving a cash amount away. Ishin are going to cut consumption tax for food to 0% for 2 years to sort of help people with the extra cost of living and the cost of rice arriving and things like that by cutting the consumption tax on food. That's what Ishin are offering. The Communist Party of Japan want to cut and then scrap the consumption tax. The DPFP want to raise the tax threshold to the rate at which you start paying tax. And the CDP, the largest opposition party facing Japan, they want to offer cash and cut consumption tax as well. So you can see sort of generally a different spectrum of approaches to sort of ease the cost of households and improve the amount of income people have on offer there. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. That gives you sort of hopefully a rough idea of some of the issues under discussion and some of the talking points of this recent election. It's sort of a little bit interesting to look at what the different range of outcomes could be and the degree of pressure the LDP might be put under as a result, and which opposition parties might be big talking points and who might do well out of this. Sanseito, of course, are a relatively minor party, but I've seen an incredible amount of talk online just talking about the polls and how well they might do in terms of a breakthrough. But of course, there's also the question of how diminished the DPFP will be by this. How Komeito in particular will do versus the LDP, and whether the government will hold on to their majority, and how bad that will be for Ishiba as a result, depending on the size of the majority, and he might even lose it, of course. And there's just a broad range of things to talk about. And also, there's been some criticism I've seen in places of how well the CDP are doing as they're sort of the main opposition and holding the LDP to account. So it'd be interesting to think how well they do, or whether, like I say, other smaller parties like Sanseito or Reiwa, for instance, might sort of steal some of the attention by getting eye-catching results in sort of district areas, or just having a little bit of an increase or a breakthrough in the results. So there's a lot to think about, and very possible big implications for Ishiba's future and what LDP in the next few years of politics in Japan could be like. So yeah, we'll just have to watch out for that. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back hopefully to give a bit of an overview once the election's in. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Sayonara, goodbye.